The golden glow of the afternoon sun spilled through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Cathedral, casting colored patterns onto the marble floor and the soft velvet of the aisle runner, as if heaven itself was blessing the union about to take place. Rows of guests, dressed in polished suits and glittering gowns, murmured quietly, fanning themselves gently while waiting for the ceremony to begin. The atmosphere saturated with anticipation and romance, and at the front of the altar stood Martin, Avery tall, clean-shaven, confident in his charcoal tuxedo, the subtle glint of a designer watch peeking from beneath his cuff, smiling politely as he shook hands with family and old college friends, nodding at his bride's father, who beamed with pride, whispering to a guest beside him, "My daughter couldn't have chosen better." Martin nodded along to the string quartet's gentle prelude. But inside, something trembled, a flicker of unrest buried deep in the hollow of his chest. Though his face betrayed nothing, because today wasn't about shadows or memories, it was about fresh starts, about proving to everyone, including himself, that he belonged in this world of high ceilings, curated vows, and champagne toasts. Not the world he had left behind without a word 3 years ago. Not the cramped apartment with moldy walls. Not the woman who clung to hope longer than she should have. Not the 5 pairs of small feet that used to chase him to the door, crying, "Daddy, don't go," as he grabbed his suitcase and said he'd be right back, just one job interview away from a better future, but he had never gone back. Never sent a word, never looked behind, because Martin had become a man who erased chapters to start new ones. And this chapter was perfect. His bride to be standing behind the tall oak doors in a designer gown worth more than a year's rent in his old life. Her family wealthy and warm, promising a kind of safety and comfort he never thought he deserved until now. Until he convinced himself that the past wasn't real unless he acknowledged it. But reality has a way of writing itself back into the story. And a few blocks away, Layla tightened the straps on her toddler's shoes with fingers that trembled from exhaustion and nerves. Her other hand brushing crumbs from her dress, the same one she wore to church every Sunday, faded blue cotton with stitched flowers along the hem. Her eyes hollow but blazing with a determination that frightened even herself. Because today wasn't about revenge, it was about truth, about looking a man in the eyes and asking why, about standing tall even after being abandoned with 5 kids and a broken heart and no closure, about giving her children the answer they deserved. Because they still whispered daddy in their sleep, still stared too long at strangers in crowds, hoping to recognize the man whose face had blurred with time. And when Layla had heard through a whispered phone call from her cousin, who worked in the kitchen of the Hamilton estate, that Martin was not only alive, but marrying the daughter of a millionaire hotel tycoon. Something inside her cracked, then hardened, and she spent 3 nights sewing clothes, finding socks that matched, braiding her daughter's hair, and preparing 5 little souls for a moment they might not understand until they were older, but would remember forever. And now, as she walked with them up the stone steps of the cathedral, the youngest in her arms, the others gripping her skirt or each other's hands, her heart pounded like a war drum, every breath filled with fear, anger, and the haunting hope that maybe, just maybe, Martin would see them and break down, that he would drop to his knees and beg forgiveness, that he would remember their youngest's middle name or their firstborn's birthday. But even if he didn't, she had come to remind him that they existed, that love wasn't disposable, that vows mattered. And she stepped through the massive doors, just as the music swelled and the bride appeared at the far end of the aisle, radiant as sunlight, unaware that the dream she'd built was about to fracture at its foundations. Because, as guests turned to admire her entrance, the doors creaked a second time, and in walked Layla, her presence small but seismic. 5 children flanking her like an army of innocence and forgotten truths. And silence fell like a thunderclap. As heads turned, jaws dropped, and the bride herself paused mid-step. Her lips parted in confusion as she looked toward the altar and saw the color drain from Martin's face, his posture collapsing as if gravity had finally caught up with all his lies, and someone whispered, "Is that his?" before falling into stunned silence, and Layla's voice rose in the stillness, quiet but sharp as a blade. "Martin, do you even remember their names?" And the children stared wide at the man in the tuxedo, their eyes searching his face for recognition, for love, for something other than the panic now spreading across his expression as he looked from Layla to the bride, to the priest, and back again, his mouth opening and closing without sound, and the bride blinked rapidly, shaking her head in disbelief, whispering, "What is this?" as her father rose from the front pew, rage flooding his features while guests began murmuring louder now, some pulling out phones, others shielding the children from the harsh light of the unfolding scandal. And Layla stepped forward slowly, the toddler clutching her neck, her feet like anchors on the marble, unafraid, unapologetic, not for herself, but for the children who deserved a father who didn't vanish. A truth that didn't hide in tuxedos and grand weddings, and for a heartbeat. The entire cathedral stood still between one breath and the next, between one world and another, and in that pause, Martin had a choice: to step forward, or to run again. To acknowledge the storm he'd tried to bury, or to pretend again that his past was just a nightmare he could forget. But before he could speak, his eldest son, just 10 years old, took a step toward him and said, "Hi, Daddy," with a voice so soft and broken that it echoed louder than any scream. And the bride dropped her bouquet, her fingers frozen in mid-air, petals scattering across the aisle like the shards of the life she thought she knew. And someone gasped, and someone cried, and Martin took one step back instead of forward. The cowardice written into his limbs as clearly as the vows he'd planned to recite, and Layla's lips trembled not from fear, not from sadness, but from the weight of vindication, of knowing she no longer needed answers, no longer needed apologies. Because the children had seen enough, had heard the truth from the silence that followed, and still, somehow, her heart ached not for the man Martin had become, but for the boy she once loved. The man who once danced with her barefoot on rainy night and kissed each of their babies on the forehead like they were treasure, and she whispered, more to herself than to him, "I just wanted you to see what you left behind," before turning away, the children following her out like a quiet procession of resilience. As whispers and gasps filled the space behind them, and the bride's tears began to fall. Outside the church, the sky had darkened slightly, as if the world itself had shifted in response to the storm that erupted inside St. Augustine's, but Layla didn't look back as she stepped onto the pavement, clutching her youngest tighter against her chest while the other children followed her in stunned silence, their footsteps slower now, their eyes wide and confused, as if the marble cathedral they had just left had swallowed something from them, something they didn't yet understand, but would carry with them like an invisible scar for the rest of their lives. And Layla felt it too, not just the ache in her chest or the tremor in her hands, but the echo of what had just happened, the way Martin's face had crumpled, the way the bride's flowers had hit the floor like bones, and though every part of her had fantasized about this moment, about the confrontation, about the truth being dragged into the light, she hadn't prepared for the aftermath, for the rawness in her children's expressions, or the way her daughter kept glancing back through the church doors as if hoping he might come running after them and say something, say anything, say he was sorry, and please don't go, and I was wrong. I was scared. I still love you. All but no footsteps followed them, and no voice called her name, only the wind curling around the stone columns. Like a quiet farewell, and for a long moment she just stood there on the sidewalk, 5 hearts thumping beside her, unsure of what to do now, where to go, whether to cry or scream or hold herself together long enough to find the broken umbrella from the bottom of her purse and pretend she was okay. Because that's what mothers do. They pretend they're okay, even when they're not, even when the father of their children doesn't flinch as they walk out of his wedding like ghosts and strangers, and Layla finally moved one step, then another, and slowly they began the walk down the hill away from the church, her 10-year-old son silently taking her hand and squeezing it like a man twice his age, like he was trying to keep her from falling apart. Though she already had years ago, when she'd waited by the door, every night when she'd stared at the empty bed, when she'd listened to the children ask if Daddy was lost, or if he had died, or if it was their fault, and she'd lied through her teeth, saying he must be busy, that he would come back, that he was trying his best to make a better life. And tonight, all of those lies had shattered with the stained glass and violin music, and now the truth hung above them like a cruel sky, the truth that he had chosen a life without them, that they were not his future, just a forgotten chapter he had edited out of his perfect story. And still, despite the rage building in her veins, Layla couldn't stop the tears that blurred her eyes, not because she missed him, but because she'd loved a man who had looked her in the eyes once and promised forever, because once he had named every child with trembling lips and kissed their tiny fingers and called them miracles, and now he stood beneath cathedral lights pretending they didn't exist. And Layla reached the corner of the street and found the bus stop, the one with a broken bench and a cracked shelter where rain leaked through the roof, and she lowered herself onto it, her children huddled beside her. And she counted their heads again, like she always did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, still here, still breathing, still hers, and that was all that mattered. Not the stairs, not the cameras, not the sound of guests murmuring behind them, not the feeling that she had just walked barefoot across broken glass and left pieces of herself behind, and one of the kids, the middle one with the big eyes, asked softly, "Mommy, is he still our daddy?" And Layla looked at him, and her heart squeezed, and for a moment she wanted to scream. "No, he isn't. Not anymore." But the words caught in her throat, because no matter what Martin had done, he was still their blood, their origin, their invisible ache. And so she just pulled him close and whispered, "I don't know, baby. I don't know." And the bus arrived late and loud, and they climbed aboard under the watchful gaze of strangers who didn't ask questions but silently moved to give them space as Layla sank into a seat, holding her youngest on her lap, brushing crumbs off her shoulder and staring out the window, not really seeing anything, just waiting for the tremble in her hands to stop, and then the cathedral chaos was unraveling, the bride frozen at the altar, the guests whispering furiously, the father demanding answers, and Martin standing still as a statue, his mind reeling like a clock with broken gears, unable to piece together what had just happened, because in all his elaborate lies and preparations and careful deletions of his former life, he never imagined they'd come for him, not like this, not with the truth dressed in patched clothing and eyes that looked too much like his own, and he remembered their faces, each of them, though he had spent years trying to forget. He remembered the way his oldest had cried when he left, the way Layla had held the baby and begged him not to go. Himself, it was temporary, just until he got a job, just until things got better. But when he met Olivia and her world was full of champagne and silence, and no diapers, and no screaming, and no scraping together rent money, he let that other world slip through his fingers and convinced himself he was a victim to that. He deserved a second chance, and now he stood here, watching that world walk out of the church like a funeral, and part of him wanted to run to them, to throw off this tuxedo, and drop to his knees in the parking lot and sob into the pavement. But he couldn't, because pride and fear and shame wove around his ankles like chains, and the bride, Olivia, was now staring at him, not crying, but blinking slowly, like someone watching. The house they built burned down from the inside, and she finally spoke, her voice cold and low. "Were you ever going to tell me?" And Martin couldn't answer, because the words were too heavy in his mouth, and her father stepped forward with a glare so sharp it cut across the room, and said, "Get out of this church before I drag you out myself." And the guests began to stand up, not in applause, not in celebration, but in anger, in pity, in disappointment, as if watching a prince turn back into a beggar. And Martin turned slowly and walked out down the aisle that had once felt like a path to a new beginning, but now felt like the hallway of a courtroom. Every eye, a jury, every breath, a judgment. And when he stepped outside, he looked left and right. But Layla was already gone, and the street was quiet. And he stood there on the steps of the cathedral, staring at the city that didn't seem to want him anymore. And he realized, too late, that he had not just lost a wedding, he had lost everything. And across the city, Layla reached their small apartment, climbed the stairs that creaked with every footstep, unlocked the door with her shaking key, and her children rushed inside, kicking off shoes, laughing with relief, as if they had escaped monster, and she followed them in, slowly shutting the door behind her, locking it twice, and resting her forehead against the wood for just a moment, breathing deep, letting the tears come, letting the truth settle, and then turning to face the only family she had ever needed, because maybe she didn't have a husband anymore. Maybe she didn't have a fairy tale or a closure, but she had 5 reasons to keep going, 5 pieces of love that Martin had tried to erase and couldn't, and she bent down and hugged them all at once, wrapping her arms around their tangled hair and sticky fingers, and whispered over and over, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm outside." The rain finally started to fall. The next morning, sunlight crept through the thin curtains of their apartment, washing the peeling walls in a tired oranges. Layla sat quietly at the edge of the couch, watching her children sleep sprawled across blankets and each other like a pile of breathing memories. The littlest one curled up with his thumb in his mouth, the oldest lying with his arms behind his head, his brow furrowed, even in rest, as if still holding the weight of yesterday. And Layla felt something she hadn't expected to feel after what happened at the church. Not anger, not sadness, but an empty calm, like the moment after a storm, when everything is wet and broken and silent. She stood up, slowly stretching her aching legs, and moved into the kitchen, where the kettle barely worked and the cabinet held only 2 tea bags and half a bag of rice. And for a second, she wanted to cry again, not because of Martin, not anymore, but because she was tired, deeply tired, in her breath, in her soul. And she wondered how many more mornings she'd have to wake up and be brave and smile and give everything she didn't have, just to keep them clothed and fed and warm. But then she glanced back through the doorway and saw her daughter open her eyes and smile, and something shifted again. Something steady and alive and strong. And Layla remembered that everything she needed was right there in that little room, with mismatched blankets and broken crayons on the floor, and laughter that could still rise from pain. And she made tea with the last of what she had and sat down on the floor, cross-legged, pouring into chipped mugs. And when the kids woke up, they didn't talk about the church or their father or the bride with the glowing dress. They just ate the leftover toast and giggled and chased each other around the couch, and Layla watched it all in silence, her heart breaking and healing at the same time, because maybe this was the truth. Maybe healing didn't look like closure. Maybe it looked like moving forward even when everything still hurt. And across town, Martin sat alone in a hotel room, the one he'd booked for his honeymoon, the one that now echoed with silence and regret, the air to clean the sheets to white, his phone buzzing with missed calls from people he didn't want to face, and Olivia hadn't spoken to him since the walk out her ring left on the marble floor of the cathedral. And when Martin looked at it, he felt something collapse inside of him, something old and rusted and heavy, and he picked it up anyway, held it for a long time, like it might burn his fingers, and then threw it across the room. Because he knew, deep down, that this was all his fault. Not Layla's, not Olivia's, not the kids he had tried to start over without ever finishing the story, and now the pages were torn, the cover missing, and all he could do was sit in silence and remember. The look in his son's eyes when he said, "Hi, Daddy," like the word still belonged to him, like it hadn't been stolen by time and absence and silence, and Martin had never hated himself more than in that moment, and for the first time in years. He cried, not the kind of crying you hide with a fist against your face, but loud broken sobs that spilled from his chest like poison, and he didn't know what to do, where to go, how to fix something he had spent years pretending didn't exist. And 2 days later, after pacing his room and staring at the ceiling and calling his own mother, only to hear her say, "I told you this would catch up to you," he got dressed in plain clothes, not his suit, not his polished shoes, and he took a long ride on a bus across the city and found himself standing at the same bus stop where Layla had taken the kids just days before, and he didn't know what he expected, didn't know if she'd spit in his face or slam the door, but he had to try. He had to see them one more time, and so he walked up the stairs of their building, heart pounding, hands sweating, knees weak, and knocked once, twice, 3 times. And when the door opened and Layla stood there in a stained shirt, holding a dish towel in one hand, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her eyes hollow and steady, and he opened his mouth to speak, but the words weren't ready. So he just stood there for a moment, like a child, and then said softly, "Can I see them?" And she didn't answer right away. She just stared, and then slowly stepped aside and let him in. And the room was small and cluttered and smelled of toast and crayons and something warm and alive, and Martin stepped inside like he was entering a world he had been banned from, and he saw them, the children, sitting on the floor, building a puzzle, and when they looked up, there was silence again. Not sharp, not angry, just still, and the youngest blinked at him, and then hid behind Layla's leg, while the others stared, and the oldest crossed his arms, not moving, and Martin knelt slowly on the carpet and whispered, "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try, if you'll let me." And Layla stood behind him, arms folded, unsure whether to laugh or scream. But she said nothing, because this moment wasn't about her. It was about them, and her children slowly stood one by one and approached Martin, cautious, curious, hurt, and Martin sat still like a statue, letting them stare, letting them touch his face like it was a mask. And the oldest finally said, "Where were you?" And Martin broke again in front of them, head down, shoulders shaking, and whispered, "I was wrong. I was a coward. I ran, and I can never fix that, but I'm here now, if you'll have me." And the oldest didn't speak, but slowly nodded and sat beside him, and the others followed, and for the first time in years, Martin felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. And over the weeks that followed, fixing the leaky sink and walking them to school, and Layla didn't smile, not at first, not for a long time, because smiles come from trust, and hers had been buried under 3 years of survival. But she watched him change, watched him show up without asking for praise or recognition, watched him hold the baby when he cried and patch shoes and sweep the hallway, and she thought, maybe this time, maybe he had finally seen the life he left behind and felt it in his bones. And one night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Martin was sitting on the floor, sorting socks, and Layla sat beside him, knees touching, barely breathing, and said quietly, "If you disappear again, I won't explain it to them. I won't lie for you again. I'll just tell them the truth, that some men don't know how to love people who love them back." And Martin looked at her eyes, glassy voice shaking, and said, "Then I won't leave again." And she didn't answer, just nodded and turned away, and they sat there for a long time in silence, the kind that wasn't empty anymore, but full of tiny, fragile beginnings. And outside, the rain fell again, soft and slow, and steady like forgiveness might someday come if you waited long enough for it.